Mr. Speaker, I too rise in support of this very important piece of legislation, H.R. 2101, the Weapons Acquisition System Reform through Enhancing Technical Knowledge and Oversight Act of 2009. And I want to begin where thanks are truly due, and that is with my good friend, my distinguished chairman, the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Skelton, who provided the inertia and the great leadership and putting together the team that has worked so hard to bring this bill to the floor. And a particular tip of the hat to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Andrews, and my friend and colleague, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Conaway, for their roles as the chairman and the ranking member in our Special Oversight Committee. They really have done yeoman's work, supported by very able members as they advanced a great piece of legislation. Obviously, Mr. Speaker, as you heard, we consider this matter to be of utmost importance. The United States taxpayers deserve to get the most bang for their buck. It's a trite saying, but very true, especially when matters of national security are involved. What's more, there's an enormous opportunity cost when major defense systems miss and overrun their budgets. The Government Accountability Office found that as 2009, the Department of Defense had, as the chairman so correctly stated, some $296 billion of cost growth on just 96 major weapons systems. And even if most of this growth is due to poor initial estimates or requirement changes and not to waste or mismanagement, the fact remains that the Department of Defense was unable to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on other planned priorities. It's in the interest of a strong national defense, therefore, that we in Congress do all that we can to rein in cost growth in the development of major weapons programs. This national security imperative is also what has driven us to quickly mark up and hopefully pass today H.R. 2101. But I would note, despite the speed with which this body has moved, the legislation we have before us is a sound, well-crafted product. We had the benefit of feedback from industry, from the Department, and from members of our Defense Acquisition Reform panel. And speaking on my own behalf, I believe this feedback has allowed our committee to draft truly a superior piece of legislation. Now, I don't want to be taken wrong here. The Senate, the other body, has passed a solid piece of legislation as well, S 454. But it's important for the House members to recognize that the legislation we have before us today will take us immediately into conference with the Senate and quite likely to the President's desk in just a matter of weeks, which is why we all believe it's all the more important to get a strong vote in support of this bill, to guarantee the voice of the House is heard in this debate so that this body will remain on the forefront of ensuring we deliver the right capability to our war fighters at the right time and at the best value. As my chairman, Mr. Skelton, has indicated, this legislation focuses on reforms on the early stage of the acquisition system, requiring the evaluation of alternative solutions at more critical points and independent oversight earlier in the process. A focus on early stage acquisition is vital. As we know, as we heard from my chairman, the sins which cause most cost overruns are generally created in the initial stages of the acquisition process. It also increases the level of independent scrutiny major weapons programs receive, not because our program managers are incapable, but because we recognize that it's an unfair burden to require program managers to be both the leading advocate for and an independent evaluator of the program. The legislation also seeks to address concerns we've heard about minimizing bureaucracy and continuing to give the Secretary of Defense the flexibility he needs to manage his own office. Despite the impressive list of reforms carried in this bill, it really is relatively narrow in scope. Some, including the New York Times editorial board, have criticized us for focusing only on acquisition of major weapons systems, stating, and I quote from one of their editorials, "Unfortunately, the House version to be voted on later applies to only about 20% of acquisitions," end quote. Well, with all due respect to the great lady, maybe $296 billion doesn't sound like a lot of money to the New York Times, but as I've previously noted, that's just the cost of overruns on these 96 programs. The total planned outlay for those 96 programs is some $1.6 trillion. I have to say that I'm fairly comfortable with taking on reforms to $1.6 trillion in government spending as just a first step this year. In addition, we deliberately narrowed the scope of our bill in order to keep the legislation aligned with the Senate and to send this bill to the President as soon as possible. The remaining 80% of DoD programs will not go unaddressed. Truth be told, acquisition workforce issues and acquisition of services have been addressed in prior years' bills. But we will not be satisfied with resting on the laurels that I think this body will accrue today in supporting this legislation. These issues will continue to be considered by the Defense Acquisition Reform Panel, which will carry on with its mandate to consider initiatives that could be addressed by the committee as part of the fiscal year 2011 National Defense Authorization Act. Mr. Speaker, in closing, I want to reemphasize that I give my full support to this bill. We owe a great debt of gratitude to those members who worked so hard to bring it to the floor today and do so with such a quality product behind it. I'm honored to stand with them in this